What's up everybody, Greg here with Lensprotogo and Lens Rentals, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the ISO performance and the exposure recovery test of the Blackmagic Pocket 6K. Now I've been doing a couple videos on this recently, answering some of your questions, and if you want to see that video, I'm going to throw a link to it right up here. But in this one, we're going to start off with the ISO performance test going from 100 all the way up to 25,600, which is the maximum ISO for this camera. And we're also going to look at the exposure recovery, so underexposing and overexposing the image 5 stops in both of the native ISOs of 400 and 3200. So let's get right into this test, checking out the ISO performance. So starting off with ISO 100, this is the lowest ISO we can get on the Blackmagic Pocket 6K, and as you expect, you get a super clean image. Going up to 200 ISO, going up another stop, still having a really clean image, and it's going to stay like this through these first couple of ISO levels. Going up to the next one, which is 400 ISO, and this is going to be the first native ISO and sort of controls this first range of sensor profile from 100 all the way up to 1000. Going up to the next one, which is going to be 800, again, a really clean image and still in that first sort of ISO profile. As we go on to this next one, we're going to be moving into the next native ISO sensor profile range at 1600. So both of these are going to have a pretty comparable ISO range. When you're on like that 1000 to 1250, you're going to want to switch over to the second ISO range because it's going to actually give you a cleaner image. Going up to 3200, this is the second native ISO and what this is sort of profiled for. And you're still getting a really clean image, especially having that 6K. And if you're downscaling to a 4K output, you're going to have a really clean image in the end. Going up to 6400, still no color noise introduced, but you definitely start to see a little bit more movement in the shadows and a little more noise in there. Up to 12,800. This is where it starts to get a little bit crazy with the color noise. It's a pretty big jump from that 6400 range up to this 12,800. And then again, going up to the next one at 25,600, this is just amplifying that even more, seeing a ton of digital color noise in there with the magenta and the greens, and a lot of visible noise with that. So is the ISO performance test of the Pocket 6K, and as you can see, you can go pretty high with this camera. 1600, 3200, you're still getting a really clean image, and even using a little bit of noise reduction, you could even go up to 6400 ISO. Where I wouldn't push this is into that 12,800 and 25,600. There's just a little bit too much color noise in there, and it's not going to be easily cleaned up with some post-production. Next up, let's jump into the exposure recovery test, looking at the first native ISO of 400. So here we are with our original shot, which is our correct exposure. And with this process, we're going to be going for an IRE around 70 on our skin tones. And that's what we're going to be considering correct exposure. For whatever you're shooting, it might be a little bit different, but that's what we're doing here. Again, at ISO 400, which is the first native ISO, we're going to start off by overexposing the image. So starting off with our first one at 1 stop overexposed, you see our overexposed image on the left side and you see our recovered shot on the right side, and then our correct exposure is just going to stay in the middle and repeat over and over again, so you can see what sort of we're comparing it to and how much we're able to bring back. And with this 1 stop, there is no problem in getting that exposure back to our 70 IRE on our skin tones. Going to 2 stops overexposed, we're getting a little bit brighter on our actual shot here, and we're still able to get all of that information back on our recovered shot. The area to look for with this, especially going into these overexposed, is the highlight areas. So in the mug that's up on the shelf and the painter's wheel over my left shoulder, those are the areas that are going to be most problematic starting out. Going to 3 stops overexposed, still all of that information is being able to be recovered in my skin tones, as well as in those brighter areas that I just talked about. You're still seeing some nice reflections and good color in all of the image. Going to 4 stops overexposed, this is going to be getting really bright with our actual shot here, but we're still able to recover almost all of it with really no color problems in the skin tones as well as those highlight areas. And this is really impressive that we can get this much information back with 4 stops overexposed. Going to 5 stops, this is where the image starts to fall apart a little bit. Again, if you look at that mug and even on my face, you can see some of that posterization as we're trying to save those highlights, and we're not really getting all of that information back, and there's really no detail in the skin anymore. So that was 5 stops. Now we're going to go back to our correct exposure. So again, this is just our correct exposure image that we've been looking at, and we're going to go in the opposite direction, underexposing this image and seeing how much we can bring back from the shadow areas. So we're going to start off with 1 stop underexposed. On the left, you can see that underexposed shot, and on the right is the recovered shot and what we've been able to bring back. And again, in that center is the correct exposure like we've just been looking at. So with this, you can definitely bring back that one stop. And the area here we want to look for is in the shadows. So the shadow of the mug right underneath that 2x4 up above my head and on the dark side of my face. That's really where we're going to start to see this fall apart first. Going to 2 stops, again, you're able to bring all this information back. You're not really having too much noise in there, and it's totally usable, and definitely you can bring it back from 2 stops to that 70 IRE level on our skin tones. Going to 3 stops underexposed, we're getting pretty dark on our actual shot here, and you can start to see a little bit of noise brought back in those shadow areas, which can definitely be cleaned up with a little bit of noise reduction in post, but it's going to be hard to start pushing it beyond this. Going to 4 stops underexposed and trying to bring that back, you're starting to see a lot of that color noise in there, basically in all of these shadow and darker areas. You're still getting some good detail in the highlights, but definitely in those shadow areas, you're losing a lot of that information and not able to bring it back as cleanly as I'd like. And then going down to 5 stops underexposed, it's just going to be even more amplified with that noise and the banding and stuff in those shadows, getting a lot of magentas and greens in there and a lot of digital noise. And this is going to be pretty much unrecoverable from this point unless it's a look you're going for. So that was the exposure recovery test at native ISO of 400. And as you can see, you can really bring back those overexposed images to a good level and not have too many color problems or clipping problems with the highlight areas. Even going into the underexposed, you can go down to 3 stops and still have a clean image, and maybe even 4 stops with a little bit of noise reduction in post, but I wouldn't recommend shooting anything more than 3 stops underexposed. Now let's jump in and take a look at the next native ISO of 3200. So like I just said, we're going to be looking at the next native ISO of 3200, doing the exact same exposure test. So here we are with our correct exposure, getting our skin tones right around that 70 IRE level. And we're going to go in these same directions. So starting with our overexposing first, overexposing by 1 stop. Again, on the left side is our actual shot, so our overexposed image, and on the right is the recovered shot, and in the center is that correct exposure that we're trying to balance everything to. Going up to 2 stops overexposed, we're able to get all that information back just like we could with the native ISO at 400, and we're keeping all of that information in the highlight areas and all of that detail that we want to see. Going to 3 stops overexposed, we're still able to get all of that information back, and this really does a great job at recovering that overexposed image. Now this is where it starts to differ a little bit from the native ISO of 400. Once we get into this 4 stops overexposed, we start to lose a little bit of detail in the face. There starts to be a little bit of a color shift. We're not getting the great reflections like we were on the mug, and we're losing all of the detail in the painter's wheel over my left shoulder. And then again, to 5 stops, we're not having any information in that highlight area. My face has a lot of posturization on it, a lot of color shift, and we're not able to get any of that detail back in either the mug, the board on the wall there, or my face and the painter's wheel in the back. Going back to our correct exposure now, we're going to go in the opposite direction, so underexposing this image. And again, we're at 3200, so I can imagine we're going to see a lot more digital noise in there once we start underexposing this image. So starting with 1 stop underexposed, we're definitely able to bring all of that information back, and we are starting to see a little bit of grain in there, but it's very natural looking. It doesn't have too much color in there, and if you're downscaling the 6K into a 4K image or 4K deliverable, it's going to be pretty clean. Once we go to 2 stops underexposed, we start to see a little bit of a color shift as well, pretty green on that recovered shot, and we're seeing a lot of noise in these shadow areas. So this is probably as far as I would push it if you're trying to recover underexposed images from this 3200 ISO. Going down to 3 stops underexposed, we're seeing pretty similar results to what we saw at the native ISO of 400 at the 5 stops underexposed. So already it's starting to fall apart a little bit quicker than we did in the 400 native ISO. Going to 4 stops, it's even more prominent. We're seeing a lot of magentas in there now, a lot of digital noise, even a little bit of banding here and there. And overall, it's just totally not usable at this 4 stops underexposed. And then lastly, we're going to go to 5 stops underexposed, which is just going to give us even more and amplify that signal and that digital noise, those magentas, greens, the color shift, all of that is just going to be amplified with this 5 stops underexposed, which is a pretty dark image to try and recover this from anyway. And that's the exposure recovery test at 3200 on the Pocket 6K. And as you can see, you can still get that overexposed area and bring that back to a reasonable level, about 4 stops overexposed, just like you can with the native ISO of 400. But unlike the native ISO of 400, you can't get into those shadows as much. I wouldn't really push it past 2 stops underexposed when you're using the 3200 native ISO. If you have any questions or you want to try out the Blackmagic Pocket 6K for yourself, check out the links in the description as well as the video up here where I answer a bunch of your questions. If you want to see more of these high ISO performance tests and the exposure recovery, definitely make sure to let me know in the comments as well as hitting that like button. Also subscribe for new videos every single week, and I'll see you in the next one.